There are a number of factors which could contribute to cases falling out. Okay. So firstly, you're right. Often, not always, but often, rape allegations involve one person, as I said at the beginning, coming forward and saying, this is how I experienced this interaction. What the police ought to do is take that seriously, investigate to the best of their abilities, marshal any resources they have to investigate the veracity of that allegation and find out whether there is a basis in fact. I'm afraid what often happens is that the police can take a derisory attitude to complainants. They say, oh, well, she was asking for it, or, that does still happen, undoubtedly. Even if they don't explicitly say, oh, she was asking for it, I'm sure she was up for it, or something similarly appalling, they will simply take a relaxed attitude to actually investigating the case. So one thing we see time and time again is the police simply not taking the steps that they would do if this was a robbery or a murder case, because they think, well, there's no big pressure because we'll eventually be able to dispose of this in a way which covers our back, but which doesn't pay proper credence to the veracity of the allegation. So there's all sorts of issues with the police.
But why is that? Sorry to interrupt. Why would they care less about rape than they do
well,
about...
let me take that generalization I've just made and qualify it, because there are also incredibly voracious and eager detectives out there working on these cases. I've seen examples of both. Detectives who take a relaxed attitude and detectives who will go way beyond what you would expect in trying to prove a particular allegation. So and I think that culture in the police is really starting to change. We had a report in 2005 from Dame Angiglione, who cited this as a problem, that under-resourcing and perhaps retrograde attitudes had led to cases falling out. And I think since then, things are starting to change. You do have specialist officers who are desperate to get results in particular cases. When it comes to, I think the answer to your question, Konstantin, is why do some officers take this approach? Because I think generally there are still officers out there with quite old school retrograde attitudes about sexual morality, which say, if she was out in a nightclub wearing a short skirt and she went home with a bloke, then she probably consented to have sex with him. That's an appalling idea. I don't think it's common among the police, but I think those attitudes still probably exist.
But isn't that what people talk about when they talk about rape culture?
They do, but the claim that they make is that is so pervasive that it can explain the prevalence of sexual violence across society, which I don't think is true. I don't think those kind of attitudes are so prevalent that it's enough to explain the prevalence of sexual violence. What we know about sexual offenders is that when you look at the vast majority of people we would consider sort of serious sexual offenders, they are serial offenders, and they're a very small portion of the population, which is hardly a surprise. The actual people that go out and target women for sexual violence is a vanishingly small percentage of the population. And those people are not affected by culture, okay? There is no evidence to suggest, for example, there was a lot in the 80s and 90s, researchers trying to prove the connection between sexual violence and pornography. So again and again, academics have tried to prove that the more you watch porn, the more likely you are to engage in sexual violence. And even when you look at people who are watching violent pornography, there is absolutely no connection between people who watch violent pornography and the prevalence of rape. Even less so is there a connection between some of the factors that are sometimes talked about as contributing to rape culture. When I wrote the book, the song, the Robin Thicke song, it's a ridiculous song, she wants it, all that sort of stuff. That was cited as contributing to rape culture. So the idea being that this song plays a part of a culture which encourages young men to commit sexual violence. And one thing and of course that's ridiculous, but what happens is that what started to happen was men who were actually convicted of sexual violence started blaming the culture that they were raised in. So I remember a number of times rape defendants who had been convicted started coming forward and said, well, I couldn't help it. I was part of a culture that encouraged me to do it, or sort of subliminally forced me to do it.
Didn't Ted Bundy also do that?
Well, there was, I think that's right, that he had, but I think it's a common trope among people who, especially who commit violence against women. Yeah. They feel able to rely on cultural influences to explain away their behaviour. And I don't think, even the most sophisticated people who argue for the existence of a rape culture don't go so far as to say that that these people have no agency. They just say that it sets a context for their behaviour. But I do think it's a slippery slope when you say well, because that rugby club listened to Robin Thicke and was dancing around being idiots, that makes them more likely to commit sexual violence. Well, then it's a natural step for someone who is eventually convicted of sexual violence to turn around and say, well, you know, how can you blame me? I'm part of a culture that's inherently misogynistic. I'm not entirely responsible for my behaviour. And when it comes to considering criminal cases, actually those fine argument, you know, the kind of the little bits of influence actually do meaningfully detract from people's agency. You can make an argument that if someone, for example, has a mental illness, they still have agency, but their responsibility is diminished. And that's why the people make these arguments, because they're saying their responsibility is diminished. Now, I think that, you know, when it comes to people who, the other thing I've learned from looking at these cases is, when people commit these offences, and the cases that you look at which are pretty cut and dry, you can see that they're going out and making a moral choice to behave in the way that they are. They're making a decision. And often when you sit down and talk to them, you can see that this isn't the result of something cultural. It's a moral decision that they have made. They've decided to go out and commit an act of violence. And this is another, just to follow that up, the feminist, what's one very interesting change is that that's occurred in the kind of feminist discourse around rape and sexual violence, is that in the 80s, rape was considered a crime of power and violence. And there was an attempt by academics, people like Germaine Greer and others, to divorce rape from sex, because the two are very, very different things. And in fact, when someone rapes someone, that's not a sexual act, it's a violent act. We've lost that distinction now. And the discussion that we have today tends to conflate rape and sex and rape and sexual etiquette in a way which is very troubling. And so when I make the argument that, you know, when someone decides to go out and commit an act of sexual violence, they are going out to commit an act of violence. They're not going out just for sexual gratification. They're going out to exert power over someone. And that's an understanding we've had for a long period of time. But now, because of this argument around rape culture, we conflate people like Robin Thicke, who likes to dance around with women in their underwear, with rapists, which is a very peculiar conflation to make considering the history of this discussion, because you never in the past would have understood rape as a mere extension of someone's sexual preference or a development of a particularly sort of sexualized piece of art. You would understand it as a violent moral choice made on behalf of the rapist. And I think the danger is losing that distinction actually has some quite troubling consequences, I think.